Just let's everybody move on, shall we? Well, we're not going to move on, obviously. But joining me now is New York Democratic Congressman and member of the House Judiciary Committee, Dan Goldman. Okay, we've all been wading through, news organizations, committees, and members of Congress, all of these documents that have come out. And there are certainly many in there. There was information in there that came from tip lines that is unsubstantiated and things like that. But there are some pieces of information in there that feels like they could warrant follow-up. But let me ask you this from more of you're a former prosecutor. Is there stuff in there that you've seen that you think warrants more questioning, more investigation, more follow-up? And if so, what stuck out to you?
Oh, I think there definitely is, even just the tip line. The tip line has allegations that Donald Trump sexually assaulted a 13-year-old. And it's unclear whether and to what extent they chased that tip down and whether there was a true investigation into it. That would obviously be something that you would want to investigate. The interesting thing that really jumps out to me about the release right now is, yes, we're combing through a lot of these communications. And certainly, I don't think anybody should be so glib as Mr. Blanche was about saying it's not a crime to party with a notorious sex trafficker, sexual predator who raped young kids at those parties. But the survivors that I have been communicating with are really upset. And they're upset for multiple reasons. They're upset because notwithstanding all the time we heard about these redactions and why they were a month and a half late, and last March they were spending hours and hours, thousands of hours redacting. The redactions were incomplete. And the whole point of the redactions under the law is to protect victim identification information. They published nude photos of potential victims. They published, I saw one document that was literally the subject of an email was,
"There are political earthquakes, and then there are moments when the ground splits open in real time." That's what happened the second word leaked out that the Clintons had caved. After weeks of defiance, after fiery legal letters and bold claims that Congress had no authority to drag them into Epstein-related testimony, they surrendered completely. And the shock wasn't just that they folded. It was the realization of what that surrender triggers next. Because the moment the Clintons agreed to filmed, transcribed depositions, the entire political world understood the same thing at once. This wasn't the end of anything. This was the beginning of something much bigger, much more dangerous, and far more unpredictable.
Was Epstein victim list, and there were about 30 plus, I'm sure you saw this, 30 plus names on it. One name was redacted. So it's not like they just missed the page. They chose not to redact those. And then when you hear the Department of Justice say, oh, there's nothing to investigate here, we would need, I think Blanche said in that interview with Laura Ingraham, oh, well, the emails aren't enough. We would need pictures aren't enough. We would need witnesses. The survivors have been asking to meet with the Department of Justice, and they have not been given that opportunity. So how can you sit there saying you need witnesses when you are not allowing the witnesses to come in? And so this is just part of a continued and massive cover-up that has been going on for a year now, where clearly they are trying to protect either Donald Trump, and there's a lot that needs to be investigated about Donald Trump in there, or others that is within their orbit, because there's still millions of pages that haven't been turned over.
Yeah, okay, I have about 12 follow-up questions from everything you just said. First, on the tip line, I asked that because I think so many people out there, you're seeing all this information flow. You don't know what to overvalue, undervalue. Obviously, those things are unsubstantiated. But what you're saying, it sounds like, is those things should be looked
unpredictable.
Into. They should have been followed
up. And every
up.
whisper in Washington keeps circling back to the same name. Not Epstein, not Clinton, but the one figure who now sits directly in the path of the precedent the Clintons just set. The shift didn't happen gradually. It happened like a dam cracking. For weeks, the Clintons had taken a posture that felt almost theatrical. Their legal team sent long, blistering letters declaring the subpoenas invalid. They argued Congress was abusing its investigative powers. They framed their refusal as a matter of principle, as if they were standing between America and authoritarian overreach. At one point, their language even hinted that complying would feed into a system designed to target them, a system they claimed had already gone too far. The message was clear. They weren't coming in. Not voluntarily, not under pressure, not ever. But pressure doesn't just appear in politics. It builds silently until it becomes something immovable. and that immovable force was Congress preparing a contempt vote that, according to multiple reports, had at least some support from Democrats. Once that signal became public, the game changed instantly. Contempt wasn't a headline. It wasn't rhetoric. It was real legal jeopardy with consequences no former president or former first lady wants on their record. Behind closed doors, their team saw the writing on the wall. Lose the fight now, or lose it publicly later. And suddenly, the defiance evaporated. The Clintons agreed to appear on camera, under oath, answering questions about the Epstein network. A complete reversal, a decision that stunned Washington, and a decision that quietly opened a door no one can close anymore. Because once one former president is forced to testify, the precedent becomes impossible to ignore, especially for someone who appears throughout those same files. But the fallout from this surrender wasn't even the most explosive part. The real shock arrived when lawmakers realized what this testimony allows investigators to do next. There's a reason people inside Congress immediately started talking about the implications for someone else. When the Clintons agreed to testify, the comparison became unavoidable. In the released Epstein files, both men appear repeatedly in logs, photos, and event lists. Both were part of the same social circles during overlapping timelines. Both had public interactions with Epstein that have circulated for years. And the moment the Clintons agreed to testify, Democrats moved instantly. If the standard is transparency, they argued, it must apply equally. If no one is above the law, it can't apply only in one direction. And if Congress now has the power, and the political will, to compel one former president to testify about his connection to Epstein, then the same authority exists for any other former president with similar ties once they leave office. The argument was simple. The logic was airtight, and the pressure it created was enormous. What made it even more potent was that Democrats didn't speak in cautious hypotheticals. They said openly that once another presidency ends, a subpoena should follow the same precedent set by the Clintons' testimony. That wasn't a suggestion. It was a marker planted firmly in the ground, and it pushed this entire story into a new chapter. Because the danger for the next person in line isn't just that they could be subpoenaed, it's what testimony under oath could reveal, contradict, or confirm. And once the Clintons sit in that chair and begin answering questions, those answers become stepping stones toward whoever comes next. But the biggest question in Washington right now isn't what Clinton will say. It's how far those questions can legally go. Once the deposition begins, investigators can ask broad, open-ended questions about events, properties, flights, conversations, and people present in Epstein's orbit. They can ask who else attended the gatherings. They can ask who flew on what plane. They can ask what was discussed, what was implied, and what was rumored at the time. They can ask about social interactions, shared acquaintances, and conversations remembered from decades ago. Nothing about these questions has to be accusatory. They simply have to establish presence, context, and awareness. And all of that falls well within the rules of a deposition. Questions can explore whether certain individuals were seen at Epstein-linked locations, whether their names were brought up among Epstein's circle, whether they were part of the same fundraisers, trips, or social gatherings, whether any unusual behavior was observed or discussed. Even if the answers are vague or limited, they still build a record. And that record creates a timeline. And that timeline creates comparison points that investigators can contrast with public statements made over the years. If even one answer contradicts previous claims of distance or unfamiliarity, it reverberates instantly. And because this is filmed, the impact isn't hidden. It becomes public record, permanent, citable, and usable for future inquiries. That's what makes the testimony so powerful. Even without making claims, even without confirming anything controversial, even without touching speculation, simple factual recollections can reshape the narrative around who knew what and when. And that's the risk that's making waves behind the scenes, which is why so many were watching closely when the next figure reacted. And that reaction wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of cheering the investigation, instead of pushing for aggressive questioning, instead of distancing himself from the Clintons and framing their testimony as overdue accountability, the reaction was strangely soft. There was a tone of sympathy, calling the situation unfortunate and labeling it a shame. There was an unexpected compliment about capability. There was language that sounded almost friendly, almost protective, at a moment when most observers expected something very different. And political analysts noticed that tone immediately. Because when someone typically leaning toward confrontation suddenly avoids it, especially on an issue as polarizing as Epstein, people start asking why. One theory circulating quietly is that keeping things cordial may reduce the chance of damaging testimony. Another theory is that projecting friendliness is a way to reframe the narrative. If there's no visible hostility, maybe the testimony won't escalate into something personal. Others suggest it's a way to appear above the fray and avoid drawing additional attention to the growing discussion about post-presidency accountability. Regardless of the motivation, the tone raised eyebrows, and while that reaction played out publicly, another crisis was unfolding behind the scenes, one that reignited the entire Epstein conversation in a way no one expected. What pushed this story back into the center of national attention wasn't the politics. It was the fallout from a massive redaction failure by the Justice Department. Survivors, advocates, and legal experts all pointed to the same disturbing issue. Personal information appeared in released files where it should never have been visible. Names that should have been obscured weren't. Photos that should have been blurred were published intact. Details that should have remained private were placed into the digital sphere, where they can never be fully removed. Lawyers representing survivors expressed outrage, saying the mishandling re-traumatized individuals who had already endured years of difficulty. Some described receiving threats after the release, adding new layers of distress. Advocates questioned whether this was negligence or something deeper, while making clear that the impact on survivors was undeniable and immediate. Lawmakers who reviewed the materials publicly noted inconsistencies. In some documents, certain names were redacted. In others, the same names appeared without protection. There were instances where pets' names were redacted while survivors' names were not. And legal experts said the failures violated the most basic expectations of victim protection. Behind the scenes, the department acted quickly, taking thousands of pages offline to correct the errors. But the damage was already done. The incident triggered calls for further scrutiny of the entire investigation, including whether certain leads were ever fully explored in the first place. And those renewed questions didn't stop at institutional failures. They extended to everyone whose name appeared in those files, which brought the political consequences right back into the spotlight. With the Clintons preparing to testify, with public attention reignited by the redaction scandal, and with lawmakers openly stating that future subpoenas must apply evenly across political lines, the momentum shifted dramatically. Democrats made it clear, if one former president faces questioning about Epstein because Congress is seeking truth, then any former president with comparable ties should face the same treatment when the time comes. That statement wasn't buried in a quiet memo. It was spoken publicly, on the record, in interviews and committee discussions. And it wasn't framed as a possibility. It was framed as an expectation. The same vigor, one lawmaker said, referencing how aggressively the investigation had pursued the Clintons. Another indicated that a post-presidency subpoena should be anticipated. These weren't political jabs, they were strategic positioning, and they put Republicans in a difficult place. If they argue the investigation is about justice, then justice must be consistent. If they argue no one is above the law, then no one can be shielded. And once that standard is set, it becomes the foundation for everything that follows, which is why the Clintons' testimony is no longer just about the Clintons. It's about what this testimony forces everyone else to confront moving forward. And that's where the real pressure begins. The domino effect is already in motion. Once the Clintons sit for recorded depositions, investigators gain something they've never had before: sworn recollections preserved forever. These statements can be referenced years from now, compared to records already released or still undisclosed, and analyzed for inconsistencies or confirmations. Even neutral answers can reshape timelines. Even vague recollections can contradict public statements from others. And any answer that establishes presence, proximity, or frequency becomes part of the evidence landscape for future inquiries. That's the long-term power of deposition testimony. It survives news cycles, it survives political seasons, it survives changes in leadership. And once one former president has contributed to that record, the argument for future testimony from anyone else becomes exponentially stronger. That's why political strategists are calling this a watershed moment. Not because of what will be said next month, but because of what this enables 5 years from now. The political world is acutely aware of the timing. And within that window lies the most consequential question of all. What happens when the next opportunity for testimony arrives? What this moment sets in motion affects everything between now and the end of the decade. The testimony happening now creates a precedent that will hang over future administrations, future investigations, and future legal battles. It ensures the Epstein network will remain an active political subject long after the cameras stop rolling. It guarantees that comparisons between Clinton statements and other public figures' narratives will continue resurfacing. And it establishes that Congress has the authority, not just theoretically, but in practice, to compel testimony from the highest levels of political power. The implications are enormous. It means no administration can assume distance from past controversies protects them. It means statements made years ago can be revisited under the scrutiny of sworn testimony. And it means political immunity ends the moment public office does. As this pressure builds, the entire landscape shifts. Public expectations change. Legal analysts begin mapping out potential future hearings. Opposing parties prepare for how to use this moment when the balance of power shifts again. And the spotlight stretches into the future, toward the next figure who now stands on a path shaped entirely by what the Clintons agreed to. For now, everyone is watching one testimony. But the real story is how that testimony becomes the first piece in a chain that extends far beyond this month, this year, or even this political moment. And the tension surrounding that future is exactly why this story isn't close to over. Because once the deposition begins, once the cameras start rolling and the questions start flowing, once names, events, timelines, and recollections are all spoken under oath, the conversation changes permanently. This isn't just about uncovering information. It's about establishing a new threshold for accountability. And that threshold doesn't disappear when the testimony ends. It expands outward. The precedent is now etched into the political system. And anyone connected to the Epstein network, whether minimally or extensively, now faces the possibility that their time under oath may come sooner than expected. Which is why the political world isn't asking what the Clintons will say. They're asking what this moment allows investigators to ask next. That's where the real story is heading. And if you want to stay ahead of what comes next, because the next chapter will be louder, riskier, and far more unpredictable, make sure you're subscribed, turn on notifications, and stay locked in. Because this story isn't slowing down, it's escalating, and the next reveal could shift everything again. If you want more deep breakdowns like this one, tap subscribe, hit like, and share this video so we can keep pushing for truth, transparency, and accountability, no matter who it leads to next.